See the child. He is pale and thin. He wears a thin and ragged linen shirt. He stokes the scullery fire. Outside lie dark-turned fields with rags of snow and darker woods beyond that harbor yet a few last wolves. His folk are known for hewers of wood and drawers of water, but in truth his father has been a schoolmaster. He lies in drink. He quotes from poets whose names are now lost. The boy crouches by the fire and watches him. The sun was just down, and to the west lay reefs of blood-red clouds, up out of which rose little desert nighthawks like fugitives from some great fire at the earth's end. He spat a dry white spit and clumped the cracked wooden stirrups against the mule's ribs, and they staggered into motion again. They pass along a ramada in a courtyard, by an old grape arbor where small fowl gnawed in the dusk among the gnarled and barren vines, and they enter a cantina where the lamps are lit, and they cross stooping under a low beam to a bar and belly up 1, 2, 3. There is an old disordered Mennonite in this place, and he turns to study them. A thin man in a leather waistcoat, a black and straight brim hat set square on his head, a thin rim of whiskers. The recruits order glasses of whiskey and drink them down and order more. There are Monte games at tables by the wall, and there are whores at another table who look the recruits over. The recruits stand sideways along the bar, with their thumbs in their belts, and watch the room. They talk among themselves of the expedition in loud voices, and the old Mennonite shakes a rueful head and sips his drink and mutters. "They'll stop you at the river," he says. The second corporal looks past his comrades. "Are you talking to me?" "At the river, be told. They'll jail you to a man." "Who will?" "The United States Army, General Worth." "The hell they will." "Pray that they will." He looks at his comrades. He leans toward the Mennonite. "What does that mean, old man?" "Do you cross that river with yon filibuster armed, you'll not cross it back." "Don't aim to cross it back. We goin' to Sonora." "What's it to you, old man?" The Mennonite watches the enshadowed dark before them as it is reflected to him in the mirror over the bar. He turns to them. His eyes are wet. He speaks slowly. "The wrath of God lies sleeping. It was hid 1,000,000 years before men were, and only men have power to wake it. Hell ain't half full. Hear me? Ye carry war of a madman's making onto a foreign land, you'll wake more than the dogs." But they berated the old man and swore at him until he moved off down the bar, muttering, and how else could it be? How these things end, in confusion and curses and blood. They drank on, and the wind blew in the streets, and the stars that had been overhead lay low in the west, and these young men fell afoul of others, and words were said that could not be put right again. And in the dawn, the kid and the second corporal knelt over the boy from Missouri, who had been named Earl. And they spoke his name, but he never spoke back. He lay on his side in the dust of the courtyard. The men were gone. The whores were gone. An old man swept the clay floor within the cantina. The boy lay with his skull broken in a pool of blood, none knew by whom. A third one came to be with them in the courtyard. It was the Mennonite. A warm wind was blowing, and the east held a gray light. The fowls roosting among the grapevines had begun to stir and call. "There is no such joy in the tavern as upon the road thereto," said the Mennonite. He had been holding his hat in his hands, and now he set it upon his head again, and turned and went out the gate. They caught up and set out each day in the dark before the day yet was, and they ate cold meat and biscuit and made no fire. The sun rose on a column, already ragged these 6 days out. Among their clothes there was small agreement, and among their hats, less. The little painted horses stepped shifty and truculent, and a vicious snarl of flies fought constantly in the bed of the game wagon. The dust the party raised was quickly dispersed and lost in the immensity of that landscape, and there was no dust other, for the pale sutler who pursued them drives unseen, and his lean horse and his lean cart leave no track upon such ground, or any ground. By 1,000 fires in the iron-blue dusk, he keeps his commissary, and he's a wry and grinning tradesman, good to follow every campaign, or hound men from their holes in just those whited regions where they've gone to hide from God. On this day, 2 men fell sick and 1 died before dark. In the morning there was another ill to take his place. The 2 of them were laid among sacks of beans and rice and coffee in the supply wagon, with blankets over them to keep them from the sun, and they rode with the slamming and jarring of the wagon, half shirring the meat from their bones, so that they cried out to be left, and then they died. The men turned out in the early morning darkness to dig their graves with the blade bones of antelope, and they covered them with stones and rode on again. In 2 days, they began to come upon bones and cast-off apparel. They saw half-buried skeletons of mules, with the bones so white and polished they seemed incandescent, even in that blazing heat, and they saw paniards and pack-saddles, and the bones of men, and they saw a mule entire, the dried and blackened carcass hard as iron. They rode on. The white noon saw them through the waste like a ghost army, so pale they were with dust, like shades of figures erased upon a board. The wolves loped paler yet, and grouped and skittered, and lifted their lean snouts on the air. At night, the horses were fed by hand from sacks of meal, and watered from buckets. There was no more sickness. The survivors lay quietly in that cratered void, and watched the white-hot stars go rifling down the dark. They took to riding by night, silent jornadas, save for the trundling of the wagons and the wheeze of the animals. Under the moonlight, a strange party of elders with the white dust thick on their mustaches and their eyebrows. They moved on, and the stars jostled and arced across the firmament and died beyond the ink-black mountains. They came to know the night skies well. Western eyes that read more geometric constructions than those names given by the ancients. Tethered to the pole star, they rode the dip around while Orion rose in the southwest like a great electric kite. The sand lay blue in the moonlight, and the iron tires of the wagons rolled among the shapes of the riders in gleaming hoops that veered and wheeled woundedly and vaguely navigational, like slender astrolabes, and the polished shoes of the horses kept hasping up like a myriad of eyes winking across the desert floor. They watched storms out there so distant they could not be heard, the silent lightning flaring sheetwise, and the thin black spine of the mountain chain fluttering and sucked away again in the dark. They saw wild horses on the plain, pounding their shadows down the night and leaving in the moonlight a vaporous dust like the palest stain of their passing. All night the wind blew, and the fine dust set their teeth on edge. Sand in everything, grit in all they ate. In the morning, a urine-colored sun rose blearily through the panes of dust on a dim world and without feature. The animals were failing. They halted and made a dry camp without wood or water, and the wretched ponies huddled and whimpered like dogs. All night sheet lightning quaked sourceless to the west beyond the midnight thunderheads, making a bluish day of the distant desert. The mountains on the sudden skyline stark and black and livid, like a land of some other order out there, whose true geology was not stone, but fear. They rode through the heat of the day following, with the water kegs empty and the horses perishing, and in the evening these elect, shabby and white with dust like a company of armed and mounted millers wandering in dementia, rode up off the desert through a gap in the low stone hills and down upon a solitary jacal, crude hut of mud and wattles and a rudimentary stable and corrals. Bone palings ruled the small and dusty purlieus here, and death seemed the most prevalent feature of the landscape. Strange fences that the sand and wind had scoured and the sun bleached and cracked like old porcelain with dry brown weather cracks, and where no life moved. The corrugated forms of the riders passed jingling across the dry, bister land and across the mud facade of the jacal, the horses trembling, smelling water. The first of the herd began to swing past them in a pall of yellow dust, rangy, slat-ribbed cattle with horns that grew a goggle and no two alike, and small, thin mules, coal-black, that shouldered one another and reared their mallet-shaped heads above the backs of the others, and then more cattle, and finally the first of the herders riding up the outer side and keeping the stalk between themselves and the mounted company. Behind them came a herd of several hundred ponies. The sergeant looked for Candelario. He kept backing along the ranks, but he could not find him. He nudged his horse through the column and moved up the far side. The lattermost of the drovers were now coming through the dust, and the captain was gesturing and shouting. The ponies had begun to veer off from the herd, and the drovers were beating their way toward this armed company met with on the plain. Already you could see through the dust on the ponies' hides the painted chevrons and the hands and rising suns and birds and fish of every device, like the shade of old work through sizing on a canvas. And now, too, you could hear above the pounding of the unshod hooves the piping of the quena, flutes made from human bones, and some among the company had begun to saw back on their mounts, and some to mill in confusion, when up from the offside of those ponies there rose a fabled horde of mounted lancers and archers, bearing shields bedight with bits of broken mirror glass that cast 1,000 unpieced suns against the eyes of their enemies. A legion of horribles, hundreds in number, half naked or clad in costumes Attic or biblical, or wardrobed out of a fevered dream, with the skins of animals and silk finery, and pieces of uniform still tracked with the blood of prior owners, coats of slain dragoons, frogged and braided cavalry jackets, one in a stovepipe hat, and one with an umbrella, and one in white stockings and a blood-stained wedding veil, and some in headgear of crane feathers or rawhide helmets that bore the horns of bull or buffalo, and one in a pigeon-tailed coat worn backwards and otherwise naked, and one in the armor of a Spanish conquistador, the breastplate and pauldrons deeply dented with the old blows of mace or saber done in another country by men whose very bones were dust, and many with their braids spliced up with the hair of other beasts, until they trailed upon the ground, and their horses' ears and tails worked with bits of brightly colored cloth, and one whose horse's whole head was painted crimson red, and all the horsemen's faces gaudy and grotesque with daubings, like a company of mounted clowns, death hilarious, all howling in a barbarous tongue, and riding down upon them, like a horde from a hell more horrible yet than the brimstone land of Christian reckoning, screeching and yammering, and clothed in smoke like those vaporous beings in regions beyond right knowing, where the eye wanders and the lip jerks and drools. "Oh my God," said the sergeant.